Our next speaker is Dr. Hawasutu Dumbuya, and she goes by Hawa. And we have the privilege of having her speak virtually at one of our grand rounds earlier this year. And she obliged us again to come back and present on photo protection strategies and benefits of skin of color. So that just segues right wonderful after our last talk. Now, Dr. Dumbuya holds a BS in pharmacology and toxicology from Massachusetts College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences in Boston, and a PhD in molecular pharmacology and physiology from Brown University. She currently leads the clinical research and scientific communications for La Roche-Posay. As you may know, that is under the branch of L'Oreal company. Everything she does at La Roche-Posay involves diversity, equity, and inclusion. But with this new title of leading the clinical research and scientific communications, she can ensure that clinical studies are diverse and projects address skin of color. So Dr. Dumbuya, thank you so much for joining us, and the time is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen. Are you able to hear me and see me well?
You are upside down.
Okay. 1 second.
Not sure why, but.
Let's see.
But we can.
My apologies. If not, I'm just going to, here's what I'm going to do. Okay. How is it now?
Perfect. Perfect.
Oh.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for the nice introduction. And thank you again for the invitation. I'm truly humbled to be part of the symposium and being part of the conversation. I've been learning a lot myself. So today, the focus of my talk will be focused on photoprotection strategies and benefits for skin of color. My only disclosure is that I am a full-time employee at L'Oreal USA as part of La Roche-Posay skincare brand. I will be discussing experimental or off-label drugs, devices, and/or therapies that have not been approved by the FDA. One of the professional practice gaps that I would like to discuss a little bit more in my talk is the following. We know that the US population is becoming more and more diverse. And because of that, there are still practicing gaps among healthcare providers, but also researchers contributing to healthcare disparities. And the gap that I want to address, hopefully, with the talk is the lack of knowledge, education, and awareness for healthcare providers and the general public on photoprotection needs, strategies, and benefits for skin of color individuals. 3 major learnings that I'm hoping that you could get from the talk and the conversation is the following. The first is to extend the understanding of the cutaneous effect of solar radiation or sunlight for all, but particularly for darker skin. Second is to demonstrate the importance and benefits of broad spectrum photoprotection for skin of color individuals. And third is to describe the clinical relevance of visible light photoprotection. So with that, here's the agenda of my talk. We'll talk a little bit about DI and skin pigmentation, the impact of sunlight on the skin, photoprotection in skin of color, particularly dissecting some of the truth and myth and also show clinical evidence. Then we'll discuss the benefits of broad spectrum photoprotection. And lastly, I will touch upon new exciting research on the need for photoprotection against visible light. Okay, so I'll start with why DI matters. And I think all of us here being part of this symposium know the importance of DEI, and it has also been touched upon the speakers this morning. We know that the US population is continuously evolving. It is projected by 2050 that individuals of non-white descent background will comprise more than 50% of the US population. Currently, there are cities where non-white individuals are already making up more than 50% of the population. And at the global level, more than 75% of the world's population are currently people with skin of color, so meaning non-white individuals. By 2050, there is an estimate that the bulk of the world's population will take place in Africa. Despite being the majority worldwide, historically, most of the consumer, medical, and scientific research have involved or been focused on white individuals. There's really a lack of knowledge and a need for information surrounding dermatological needs, concerns, and differences for skin of color populations. With the US population growing and evolving, the clinical profile of the average patient presenting to the dermatologist or just to the doctor in general is changing, which really forces us to better understanding the racial and ethnic variations in the prevalence, clinical presentation, and optimal treatment approaches to both medical and aesthetic. So let's talk a little bit about skin pigmentation and defining skin of color. We know that melanin is the main pigment that determines not only skin pigmentation or skin color, but also the hair and eye colors. And there are three main factors that determine melanin variations in the skin. The first one is the expression and activity of tyrosinase, which is the main enzyme responsible for melanin production. And so darker skin tones tend to have a higher expression and activity of that enzyme. Secondly is the type of melanin and the amount of melanin that your melanocytes have. Interestingly, we're all born with the same number of melanocytes. The only difference is the amount and type. So melanin exists mainly in two forms. There's the eumelanin, which has a black-brown color, and pheomelanin that has a yellow and red pigment. Depending on your eumelanin and pheomelanin ratio, that will dictate not only your skin tone, but also how you normally respond to the sun. So for someone like me, as you can see, I have a lot of that eumelanin in my eyes, skin, and hair. And third, the last key factor in determining melanin variations is the number and the maturity levels of your melanosomes, which are the small little vesicles that where melanin is being produced. And this is what this little diagram is highlighting here. It's showing you the melanocytes, the cells responsible for melanin, on a light skin, in a light skin versus a dark skin. The melanosomes where the melanin is being produced are highlighted by the small dots inside the cell. So you have the black dots here in the dark skin and the lighter dots here in the light skin. And the main difference between the two when it comes to melanosomes is that in a darker skin, the melanosomes tends to be fully packed, more mature with melanin, and you see them across the skin, not only necessarily at the basal layer of the skin. While in a lighter skin, the melanosomes tends to be less in number, less packed with melanin, and they tend to stay at the basal layer of the epidermis. The term of skin of color on this right diagram here, I like this diagram. So the term skin of color encompasses a wide range of ethnic groups, skin complexions, and cultures that characterize individuals with deeply pigmented skin. There is the structural and functional variations, as well as cultural practices, which all contributes to the variations in the clinical presentations and prevalence of conditions. And I think it's important as a researcher in product development to really think about the cultural, the structural, and the cultural standards when developing products, but also counseling patients about what type of products or drugs is best suited for their skin conditions. So now that we know about melanin and skin pigmentation, let's review the impact of sun on our skin. So solar radiation or sunlight that reaches the Earth's surface contains about 5% UV or ultraviolet light, 45% visible light, and 50% infrared. Visible light is the light that is visible to the naked eye. So think of all the colors, blue, red, yellow, orange, green, and so forth. And infrared is the portion of the sunlight that allows us to feel that warmth. Now, in turn, the portion of UV light of the solar radiation can then be further broken down into three major wavelengths: UVC, UVB, and UVA. So ultraviolet C, ultraviolet B, and ultraviolet A. And in turn, UVA can then be broken down into UVA2, which is short UVA, and UVA1, which is long UVA. Depending on the wavelength, the penetration of sunlight on the skin can vary. So thankfully, depending on the wavelength, the penetration of the skin will vary, but also depending on the wavelength, it also plays a role into the toxicity of the wavelength. So technically, the shortest wavelength is UVC. So it is actually the most toxic wavelength radiated by sunlight. But thankfully, most of it gets to be absorbed by the ozone layer at the Earth's surface, leaving our skin exposed to 5% UVB and 95% UVA when it comes to that UV portion, and followed by visible light and infrared. So the general rule is the shorter the wavelength, the shorter the wavelength, the more toxic it is, but the longer the wavelength, the deeper the penetration into the tissue. And as we'll get to see in the next few slides, depending on the level of exposure, the nature of your skin phototype, so meaning the amount of melanin, the type of melanin, and how you respond to the sun, the impact of the sun can vary. But overall, we know that sunlight-induced cutaneous responses include sunburn, peeling, erythema, hyperpigmentation for the short term of exposure. And then for longer term of exposure, there's photoaging and skin cancers. What I want to highlight is that photoprotection is essential for all skin tones to minimize both acute and chronic effect of sun exposure. In this slide, I wanted to show you the current knowledge that we have on the impact of the sun on the skin per wavelength. So in this table, we are looking at each wavelength, so UVB, short UVA, long UVA, visible light, and infrared. And on this side, we are also looking at each wavelength and the differences when it comes to molecular pathways, clinical endpoints, and so meaning what type of skin responses do they cause, and then the strategies that we have for protection. In order for sunlight to cause a biological effect, it requires a direct interaction of sunlight photons with chromophores, which are molecular targets that, when excited, generate a signal. So for this reason, out of all these wavelengths, UVB and UVA effects on the skin are the most characterized. And thanks to this knowledge, we now have UV filters, both chemical and mineral, or non-organic and organic, that are currently our best photoprotection technologies for the UV portion of sunlight. Where we lack technologies is in the visible light and infrared spectra, because for a very long time, skin optic research has focused on the UV portion of sunlight, but in the last 20 years, there's been great effort in trying to understand the effect of visible light and infrared on the skin. And we'll get to talk a little bit more about it in the next few slides. Okay, so despite a misconception, I want to emphasize that sunlight can also lead to erythema, hyperpigmentation, photoaging, and skin cancers in skin of color. It is dependent on the nature of exposure, as well as the person's Fitzpatrick skin phototype, so meaning the amount of melanin and how they respond to sunlight. And also, how do they normally respond to, how can I say, what it takes to cause a minimal erythema response or a pigmentation response. We now know that visible light, not just UV, can also generate oxidative stress, lead to erythema, and most importantly, contribute to skin darkening in skin of color. And I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next few slides. Essentially, all that to say that photoprotection is really crucial to minimize the acute and chronic effect of sun exposure in darker skin. Despite the growing evidence and awareness that sun exposure can have all skin tones, compared to lighter folks, skin of color individuals are less likely to use sunscreen and practice other photoprotective behaviors for various reasons. Some common reasons that I've highlighted here are, for instance, the misconception that their melanin-rich skin provides sufficient protection against the sun. And I myself was guilty of that for a very, very long time. I had to do my first clinical study to start wearing sunscreen. So I'm guilty of that. Some of the other reasons is because sunscreens may leave this white cast or chalky appearance on darker skin. And overall, there's really just a lack of awareness and education on the needs and the benefits of sun protection for skin of color with the general public, medical, and scientific communities. You know, I'm curious, feel free to comment on the chat box on your experience on counseling patients of color on wearing sunscreen or non-patients of color on wearing sunscreen, and also your experience on wanting to wear sunscreen and recommend it to your friends or family. I'm curious. With that, I like to review some of these graphs here, which I thought was interesting for all of us to keep in mind. So this is one study that looked at the prevalence of sun protective behaviors in the US from 2003 to 2006 in 3 different groups: white individuals, Hispanic, and Blacks. On the y-axis, you have the percentage of prevalence, and the different colors highlight the different ways of sun protective behaviors, from shades, long sleeves, hats, and sunscreen. And you can see that compared to whites, skin of color from Hispanics background, and Blacks were less likely to use sunscreen. Another study that I thought was very interesting is the following. In this study, they look at sun protective behaviors in Black individuals from 3 different countries: the UK, South Africa, and Nigeria. And you can see that despite looking at the same ethnic race group per se, depending on where they were living, the sun protective behaviors was very differently. So you can see that the Black folks in the UK, most of them did not practice sun protective behaviors. While in South Africa and Nigeria, you can see that the differences among the country. I really like the study done by one of my colleagues within L'Oreal, because it highlights that we cannot just assume that because you're a skin of color person that you will behave in a certain way. Depending on the way you were raised, your cultural background, where you live, where have you lived, the sun protective behaviors might be different. And talking about diversity and DEI within this conversation, it's important to also speak about the Native Americans, like my prior speaker did. This is one of the few clinical studies that she also had highlighted, looking at skin cancer epidemiology and sun protective behaviors among Native Americans. And I like to mention this study because in the study, they looked at the sun protective behaviors in Native American groups, and though the majority did experience sunburns, that group did not use sunscreens. So as you can see, there's really a need for education and advocacy on this topic for all skin tones, especially for skin of color. There's more and more studies highlighting that compared to white counterparts, skin of color communities are less likely to get skin cancers, but experience poor prognosis. And as my fellow speaker prior to my talk, this is in partly due to, again, the lack of education, the lack of awareness, late detection of skin cancers in darker skin, and the lack of understanding of the clinical presentations of skin cancers on darker skin tones versus on white skin or lighter skin tones. So with all that in mind, within our research group, internally, we realized that most of the clinical studies that we have done that speaks on the benefits of wearing sunscreens were evaluated on white individuals. So first looking at photoprotection skin of color, we ran a clinical studies to look at the benefits of wearing sunscreens on darker skin. And here it is. So in collaboration with board-certified dermatologists, we investigated the effect of regular sunscreen usage in patients of color. So here's the study design. We've done the study in Washington, D.C. We included 100 healthy subjects from African American and Hispanic descent, ages between 18 to 60 years old that were enrolled. Both groups were randomized into, all subjects were randomized into 2 groups. One group that was instructed to use an SPF 30 and another group that was instructed to use an SPF 60 daily for 8 weeks and to be applied on the face, necks, and hands. And I want to emphasize that these individuals did not priorly wear sunscreens. So they were non-sunscreen users. All evaluations consisted at looking at the dyschromia of skin color change over time, up to 8 weeks, okay? So here are the results. So we completed a study with 89 subjects, and you can see the breakdown here. Overall, it was well-balanced between male and female, and including African-American and Hispanic. And here are some of the pieces of the data. So here you are looking at objective assessment of skin lightening, of skin brightening. And it's done by using an instrument that measures skin color called a chromometer. And what we're looking at is the L value. The L value is a measurement of lightness. The higher the value, the lighter the color of that object or skin is. So where we're looking at here is on the y-axis, we have the different locations of the body, forehead, cheeks, neck, and hands. And then the different colors highlight the different time point from baseline, week 4, and week 8. And you can see that by just wearing sunscreen, at least once a day, we were able to brightening the overall appearance of these locations over time. So here are some images that were representative of the clinical and instrumental data that we obtained. In this image, you are looking at one African-American subject, male. You have the baseline picture and the week 8 picture. And you can see by just wearing a sunscreen, when you compare the baseline, when you compare the week 8 and the baseline image, you can see that overall his skin was more brighter. He has a natural glow, as you can see here, and some of his hyperpigmentations were lightening over time, indicating that it improves skin tone overall. There's another subject from Hispanic background, and I hope you can appreciate that he has also a natural glow after 8 weeks. And you can see that some of these hyperpigmentations on the face were lightening over time. And again, this is just by wearing sunscreen. Here's the same subject, but now we're looking at his hands. And I hope you can appreciate that his skin is a bit lighter or brighter. And you can also notice that the elevated hyperpigmentations on his skin were reduced in number, but also appear lighter, really indicating that long-term daily use of a broad spectrum sunscreen, at least of SPF 30, provides significant benefit in reducing hyperpigmentation and improving overall skin quality in patients of color. So that is very important because we know that hyperpigmentation or just dyschromia is a skin concern that really impacts quality of life of people of color more than white individuals. Okay, so now I want to come back to the point made of using broad spectrum sunscreen. That's really the key. You want to be able to recommend a sunscreen that have both UVB and UVA protection. That's what it means by broad spectrum. If you recall earlier, I showed you that UV consists of UVB and UVA. And as I mentioned, for quite some time, the research has focused on UVB because it was thought to be the most toxic as the second highest energy wavelength. But more and more research demonstrated that actually UVA can also impact the skin, but in a different way. And so there's been great effort in trying to identify UV filters and other ingredients that can extend protection beyond UVB and provide broad spectrum. And so in this next section, I wanted to tell you a little bit of what we have done here at our company. So our lab scientists and formulators identify a unique combination of ingredients to provide broad spectrum photoprotection. The first component is called Oxynex ST. And when you think of sun exposure, we know that sun exposure generates reactive oxygen species. Think of these molecules as very reactive and unstable oxygen molecule. They can react with everything, including DNA, protein, and lipids. And through this reaction, they can cause damage. One of the most reactive oxygen species is singlet oxygen. Well, Oxynex ST is a powerful singlet oxygen quencher, and it acts as a stabilizer of light-sensitive ingredients. So that's the first component. The second component of this formulation is a powerful antioxidant that comes from the leaves of Cassia alata, and there's a picture here. Something really interesting about this tree is that when it is exposed to sunlight, it creates this molecule called K3OS to protect its leaves against excessive sun exposure. Once this K3OS is extracted and then applied on skin cells, so in the lab, we have data demonstrating that this antioxidant can protect skin cells against UV-induced DNA damage. So we thought that this could be a powerful new ingredient to add to this little cocktail. And the third element of this combination of this broad spectrum formula are sunspheres. Sunspheres, think of sunspheres as sunscreen liposomes. So based on their unique hollow sphere, they are used to boost SPF efficacy. And when those three components are combined, they can enhance UV absorption, particularly in the UVA spectrum. So what you're seeing here is a graph looking at UV absorption in turbo, so in a tube or on a plate. And what you see is that on the x-axis, we have the wavelength, UVB, short UVA, and long UVA. And then on the y-axis, we have the MPF, which is really an absorption measurement. The higher the level, the better the absorption, indicating the better protection. And what you see is that the blue lines are all very old formulas, and the orange line is this new combination, a new formula containing this new combination that I just that I just went through with you on the prior slide. And you can see that the combination of these ingredients not only increased the absorption within the UVB, but it also extended the protection within the UVA wavelength. And so once we had that formula and we had this piece of data, we did a lot of studies in vitro, and then we went into clinicals to see the efficacy of that formulation. One of the clinical studies that we've done was the following. We performed a clinical study to evaluate this new broad spectrum formula to protect against UV exposure. And the setup was very similar in what we do for SPF testing. We had 10 healthy subjects with phototype skin, with phototype 1 to 3. All subjects were pre-treated on their back with different combinations of that formula. So we had a control, we had a vehicle, and we have various combinations of that formula, which I will go on the next slide. We exposed them to UV, and then after 24 hours after the exposure, we collected skin samples to look at skin biomarkers. So here are the main results. So on this slide, we're looking at DNA damage induced by UVA. So on the x-axis, on the y-axis, we're looking at thymine dimers. So thymine dimers are DNA mutations induced by UV. It's a very signature mark of UVA-induced mutations. And we're looking at from the skin samples taken from the back of the subject that were exposed to UV. On the y-axis, we have the different groups that we had. So we had the placebo group that was exposed to UV. So meaning the formula just containing the base of the formula, think of a vehicle. Then we have a formula that only contained the UV filters. Then we had the broad spectrum formula, so containing the UV filters, the antioxidants, and a powerful combo that I shared with you earlier. And then we have a control group, which was untreated and non-exposed. So what you can see is that, as expected, when the skin was exposed to UV, when the skin was pre-treated with a placebo, the vehicle, and exposed to UV, we have an increase in thymine dimers expression. So we have an increase in DNA damage induced by UV. When the skin was pre-treated with only the UV filters cocktail and then exposed to UV, we are able to prevent DNA damage induced by UV by 50%. Now, when the skin was pre-treated with that broad spectrum formula, we were able to completely prevent UV-induced DNA damage in the skin, comparable to the skin not being exposed, indicating that broad spectrum formulation effectively reduces DNA damage in the skin induced by UV exposure, comparable to no exposure. So really stressing the importance again, what you want is a broad spectrum sunscreen to be recommended to all your patients, including skin of color, because not only will improve the quality of their skin and manage hyperpigmentation, but at the cellular level, you are actively protecting the skin against UV-induced DNA damage. Okay, so now that we've discussed the importance of broad spectrum photoprotection, now I wanted to talk in this section and share exciting new research on photoprotection beyond UV. So as I mentioned earlier, where we lack technologies still today is in the visible light and infrared spectrum of the solar radiation. So where we have technology and protection, the UV filters does a great job against UVB and UVA. Now the next phase, the next exciting thing in photoprotection research is visible light and infrared, so beyond UV. In the last 20 years, there's been really great effort in trying to understand the effect of visible light on the human skin and determine photoprotection strategies. So here are the main takeaways from literature. So first thing you need to know is that similar to UVA, visible light can generate oxidative stress and cause both immediate and persistent pigment darkening in phototype 3 to 4. Secondly, when visible light is combined with long UVA, it can induce erythema in lighter skin tone, like phototype 1 to 3, so here, and pigmentation and inflammation in subject with phototype 4 to 6. And now, more recently, we know that within the visible light spectrum, we know it's the blue light that is responsible. This is blue light, also known as high energy visible light, which is responsible for the major contribution into long-lasting hyperpigmentation in skin of color. So let's take a closer look at the molecular mechanism why skin of color individuals are more susceptible to visible light-induced skin pigmentation. So it turns out that our melanocytes have the ability to detect blue light. So in this slide, I'm highlighting some of the research. We've been knowing for a very long time in photoprotection that visible light can contribute to skin darkening and worsening of dyschromia in individuals of skin of color from phototype 3 and above, or some will say phototype 4 and above. What we didn't know is the molecular mechanism. And it's been only about 4 years now that we have identified who is the main contributor at the cellular level. So it turns out that melanocytes also express photoreceptors. So photoreceptors are receptors that are actually present in our eyes that enables us to see by picking up light. It turns out that the eyes are not the only organ that express photoreceptors. The skin also express photoreceptors, more particularly melanocytes also express photoreceptors. And the one that is responsible for that visible light or that blue light induced hyperpigmentation is opsin 3, OPN3, or photoprotection opsin 3. And this is what this picture is highlighting, that out of all the different photoreceptors that we know, whether in the skin or in the eyes, opsin 3 is the most highly expressed in melanocytes. The second thing that we were able to demonstrate within the company is the following, the mechanism. So what you're seeing here is that it's an assay looking at the level of activity of tyrosinase, which is the main enzyme responsible for melanin synthesis. They obtain melanocytes from lighter skin tones, donors, and darker skin tones. And what they do is that they shine light on these cells and look at the tyrosinase activity. And what they saw is that only the dark melanocytes, or only the melanocytes obtained from dark donors, had a higher expression activity of tyrosinase in response to blue light, not the melanocytes obtained from light donors. So this was groundbreaking because it explained at the cellular level why individuals of color experiences a stronger and more persistent pigmentation response induced by sunlight and visible light. And this little diagram here is highlighting that we have the melanocytes. The melanocytes contain this opsin receptor, which detects blue light, and through this specific mechanism induces melanin increase. So this overall really explained, again, at the cellular level, why folks of color are more susceptible to visible light-induced hyperpigmentation, because melanocytes from dark individuals has this signaling pathway that is more equipped and more sensitive to blue light-induced melanin synthesis. From a research perspective, what has been very interesting to see is the growing relevance of visible and blue light with the general public. As the number of hours people are spending in front of laptops, smartphones, and TV screens has increased, especially during the pandemic, there's now a growing concern and awareness of the general public on the increased exposure of visible or blue light and its potential impact on sleep and skin health. So these are a few examples. And because of this growing concern, that really leads to a growing interest from patients for products offering blue light protection. So according to Mintel, if we look per country, there has been a 33% increase in launches with products claiming blue light protection just in the US from 2015 to 2019, as you can see. And despite this growing number of products claiming visible and blue light photoprotection, there's actually no regulatory guidelines or standards to demonstrate clinical efficacy of product and support claims. Just like we have for SPF. SPF stands for sun protection factor. It is regulated and determined by the FDA standard, but we don't have that for blue light. And the truth is that there's actually a limited number of sun care products offering real visible light protection. In the research world, there's growing evidence that metal oxides, such as titanium oxide, iron oxide, and zinc oxide, and/or pigment, when incorporated into sunscreen, can offer visible light protection. However, the required concentration needed to provide clinical efficacy remains very unclear. It's still under investigation. So considering the scientific evidence of visible light effects on the skin and the growing consumer awareness and interest for visible light protection in beauty products, we saw the need and an opportunity to develop a model where we could test new or existing products for visible light protection efficacy. And for that, we collaborated with Dr. Pearl Grimes, who is a board-certified dermatologist, to run a knowledge study whose goal was to evaluate the impact of visible light on the skin and test products for efficacy. Here's the study design. It was done at one center and it was randomized. We had 10 healthy female subjects 18 to 50 years old with phototype 4. The products were all applied 15 minutes before each irradiation, so following FDA regulations for the SPF. And the visible light irradiation consisted of one dose of 144 joules per centimeter square over 4 days, which is equivalent of standing under the sun at 12 p.m. in New York City with no clouds. And all evaluations consisted at looking at skin pigmentations over time, up to 14 days. So here are the results. So first, if you are interested in this publication, it was published in a Journal of Drug Dermatology in collaboration with Dr. Pearl Grimes. And here are some of the details about the result. So we had 3 products, one mineral SPF 50, which consisted of zinc oxide and titanium oxide. Then we had 2 formulations, one that had a beige color that contained titanium oxide and iron oxide, and another formulation that has a dark brown color, like my skin tone. And that formulation only contained iron oxide. We did the exposures and then monitored pigmentation. And here's our images. What we're looking at here are the different groups. We had one group that was not exposed. One zone that was not exposed. One zone that was only exposed to visible light, only to visible light. One zone that was pre-treated with a mineral SPF and then exposed to visible light. Another zone that was pre-treated with a beige color product and then exposed to visible light. And then lastly, one zone that was treated with a brown color and then exposed to visible light. What you're looking at here are the time points. Day 1 represents 24 hours after the first exposure. Day 4 represents 24 hours after the last exposure. And then day 14 represents 14 days post first exposure. What you see is that when the skin is not exposed to visible light, you don't see a pigmentation response, which is expected. When the skin was exposed to visible light, you can see a pigmentation response that took place. And the way to look at this is to look at the square. You can see there's a darkening or browning in the middle compared to the contour of the skin, which was not exposed. This is the first dose and this is the last dose. And you can see that this pigmentation response was long lasting. It lasted up to 14 days. What was interesting is that when the skin was treated or pre-treated with the mineral SPF of 50 plus, the pigmentation was not prevented. And I hope you can see it is comparable to no product being applied. But when the skin was pre-treated with the iron oxide containing formulations, whether the beige color or the brown color, you can see that the pigmentation response was prevented and is comparable to no exposure. So this indicated that first, visible light can induce hyperpigmentation in phototype 4 and higher. And second, that minimal SPF 50 plus, depending on that formulation, it may not provide you protection beyond UV. And lastly, iron oxide containing formulations, so pigmented formulations, may offer protection beyond UV and against visible light hyperpigmentation for skin of color. So on this slide, what I wanted to tell you is that we have a publication upcoming, and we collaborated with Dr. Henry Lim, who is a thought leader in photoprotection and a board-certified dermatologist. And all I wanted to highlight to you is that depending on the formulation, it's very important to choose broad spectrum sunscreen, but also formulations for darker skin tones that are pigmented, because it will extend protection beyond UV and against visible light hyperpigmentation. And we know that dyschromia is one of the top key concerns for people of color. Okay, so what I would like to highlight here is that, in summary, long-term daily use of broad spectrum sunscreen, at least of an SPF 30, provides significant benefits in reducing hyperpigmentation and improving overall skin quality in skin of color patients. We demonstrated that iron oxide containing formulations can protect against visible light-induced hyperpigmentation. And research exploring new molecular pathways is important for building a more completer and more inclusive sun care strategy for skin of color communities. I really hope that our findings can help educate and advocate for daily sunscreen use among skin of color patients. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention, and thank you again for having lend me the opportunity to present and share some of our research. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dumbuya. We have a couple of questions in the chat. For the iron oxide study that you just talked about, what size particles were used in product A? So it's kind of a specific question. Was it micro-sized, nano-sized?
Yes, so the product was not of ours, but it was micro-sized zinc oxide particles. Yes, because, and I know where that question is coming from. It's a great question. There's I wouldn't say evidence, but concern that depending on the particles of titanium oxide or zinc oxide, that can lead to skin toxicity. So the one that formula, that minimal SPF 50, was macronized particles.
Thank you. And then there's some comments for when you asked about what are some of the preconceived notions that people tend to see. One person saying that they find that when they're counseling skin of color patients on the use of sunscreen, they tend to get more buy-in when they stress the importance of prevention of dyspigmentation. And another one is saying that a common myth that they've observed is that darker skin patients endorse that melanin protects their skin from the sun, and that dark skin doesn't sunburn.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And to be honest, that's something that, again, I used to be a big believer that being a darker person, I did not need sunscreen, but I did not need sunscreen. And I think there's multiple reasons that led me to that. First, being darkly pigmented, I felt that my melanin was sufficient. The main communication of wearing sunscreens is all surrounding skin cancers. And as dark individuals, we are less likely to get skin cancer. And so we think that we may not need it. But to the other comments point, there are other benefits of wearing sunscreen for skin of color, not only to protect against sun-induced skin cancers, but also managing a more skin tone that is more even. So maybe that is a way that we need to communicate and advocate for the sun protective behaviors to skin of color. Maybe the catch is more on managing hyperpigmentation and managing dyschromia, because if we think of skin cancers as a dark individual, that may not be a big concern. And so thank you for sharing. It's something that even as, as part of a research group and education group, that's something that we often think about. What are some of the educational programs or advocacy programs that we can do on raising awareness on the importance of photoprotection and the benefits of sun protection for darker skin tones? So I agree, it's still a challenge today.
Dr. Dumbuya, yeah, one thing that I always tend to talk about with my patients of color, especially African Americans, is they many times come in and want all of the quote unquote moles off of their face. And they're describing dermatosis papulosa nigra and, you know, the Morgan Freeman look. And so, especially when it's of that face, the malar region, temple areas, that is sun induced. And so that is something that many times I will counsel my skin of color patients on, and they tend to want to readily go ahead and apply it. But how I've not, and maybe I just haven't gone out to look for those darker iron oxide tones. I have found the lighter you know, colors that could be for maybe you know, fits 1 through 3 or 4.
Right.
But what do you, are there some other ones out there that can be found?
Yeah, no, great question. It's true that most current tinted sunscreens do not go beyond beige color. So at this moment, what I will best recommend for folks darker is to apply your sunscreen, whatever sunscreen that is, whether it's chemical, mineral, and then apply your foundation if you are a woman, or if you are someone who uses foundation, so that it matches your skin, so that you would have iron oxides, because foundations are really like 40% iron oxide, most of them. And so you can make your own personalized tinted sunscreen by combining your sunscreen and your own foundation. That's what I recommend now. But let's just say within the photoprotection field, this is a big hot topic. So I'm hoping that in the next few years, we will have sunscreens with SPF that are tinted but darker, that will go up to me maybe. And I know this is a big topic in product development and so forth. But for now, try to maybe have your own personalized sunscreen by mixing, you know, your sunscreen and your foundation, by layering it. That's what I do.
Excellent. And there was just one quick comment from our previous speaker, Dr. Postligua. The darker ones even tend to be reddish. Powder, like color science, is also helpful. Just something comment there. But all right, well, you have a poll question that you would like to ask.
Yes, that's right. So thank you everyone for your engagement. One poll question, I'm curious, based on what you have learned today from the talk, will you adjust your approach to sun care strategies for your patients? It's a simple yes or no question, and I will appreciate if you can all take it. Thank you. And again, thank you for your participation, and Dr. Allen and the team, thank you for inviting me.
Excellent, thank you. It seems like all of our speakers are just right in tune with each other. And everything is building upon each other. So thank you so much. Hopefully you can stay around as long as you can.
Thank you. And the answer to the poll, it looks like the majority said yes. So thanks again. This is all part of, again, education and advocacy. And I look forward to staying in touch with all of you. So thanks again.
Thank you.